Greetings from the Blessed Michael McGivney Pilgrimage Center in New Haven, Connecticut. And thank you for your patience as we worked out some technical difficulties on my end. I'm sorry for that, but today is June 15th, 2022, and our presentation is being recorded. So whether you are watching this live or on demand, thank you for your interest in our topic. Please share the link with others so they may like and benefit from the presentation as well. For those viewing live, there is at the right side of the screen a utility for you to submit written questions, which we will address toward the end of the session. I expect that the presentation should last somewhere between 30 to 40 minutes. There is also a handout prepared by our presenter, Dr. Msgr, available for download. There is a for further study handout, and you can download that as well using that utility at the right side. Very intentionally, these presentations from the McGivney Center have centered on Blessed Michael McGivney, either personally or at least the late 19th century era, the period in which he lived. Lately, however, we have broadened the historical focus and crossed into the 20th century, and that is where we will be today, and with good reason. Many of you know that the Knights of Columbus, which Father McGivney founded in 1882, was somewhat slow to develop initially. However, by the start of the 20th century, it had a lot of momentum and was advancing steadily, both in membership growth as well as in its outreach. Last month, recall that we had a presentation about St. Pedro Maldonado, a Mexican priest. We learned that the city of El Paso, Texas was very significant in his life. And it's very significant again in Knights of Columbus history. In 1916, after Mexico under General Pancho Villa had attacked Columbus, New Mexico, many US militia had taken up a defensive posture. Now, these militia are similar to National Guardsmen by today's standards. They took up a defensive position along the Mexican border, the US-Mexican border. And Knights, beginning with Council 638 in El Paso, Texas, established spiritual and recreation centers for the Catholic troops among them, in particular, but not exclusive to Catholic troops. And with this experience fresh in mind, when Congress declared war against the German Empire in 1917, and began drafting an army to enter World War I, the Knights volunteered to expand their recreation center model on all of the training centers throughout the United States and then ultimately overseas as the troops deployed. I'm not going to say any more because I'll trample over our presenter, so I'll stop there. But what we'll learn is that this initiative of support with the World War I troops required authorization of the institutional Catholic Church in the United States. And importantly, the Catholic Church in America was not as institutional as many of us understand it in the sense today. To unpack all of this is with us Dr. Maria Msgr from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. She is curator of American Catholic History collections as part of the special collections at CUA. She initially served as education archivist with the special collections at the university beginning in 2005. Dr. Msgr earned her PhD from the Catholic University in the realm of US history, and she also serves as an adjunct instructor in the history department at CUA. CUA was founded in 1888. It's one of, if not the first formal Catholic institution on a national scale in the United States. And as such, it has served to either record or assemble church history for well more than a century. And so we may be grateful for the sources that Dr. Msgr brings to this presentation and take keen interest in the Knights of Columbus role played in the early stages. So, hoping that I've given you a good setup, Maria, I thank you for your willingness to join us today. I'm fascinated by this topic, and I'm sure that our listeners will be as well. I turn the presentation over to you.
Great. So first of all, Peter, thank you for inviting me. Thanks to the Blessed Michael McGivney Pilgrimage Center for inviting me to speak to the group. I'm really happy to be here to talk about the early history of the Bishops' Conference, and that was really a great introduction, all of that background on the importance of the Knights of Columbus, because you have their records, we don't have their records, but our records touch on the Knights of Columbus, and we're going to kind of move from that direction. But I do want to say, first of all, that I assure you, we on the Catholic University campus all know who the Blessed Michael McGivney is. Here's a statue of him for those of you who haven't been to campus. It's right in the center of our campus. It's right next to what's known as McGivney Hall. And there are some students studying by that recently renovated and installed statue, renovated building and installed statue. So we are very familiar with his presence here on campus. So I would start with that. So to begin with, we have a bit of a confusing and interesting history of the genealogy of the Conference of Catholic Bishops. So I just want to give you kind of this overview before we dip into the National Catholic War Council and how it evolved into the Bishops' Conference. So generally speaking, the evolution of national Catholic institutions in the early 20th century US occurred to address Catholic needs as the Catholic population exploded really between 1890 and 1920. Institutions related to education, charity, immigration, and politics were established as part of a drive to serve Catholics in a predominantly Protestant culture. And a key player in these developments was the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. So the Bishops' Conference was initially established, as Peter referenced, in 1917 to coordinate with the Knights of Columbus Catholic activities related to the First World War. So it was called the National Catholic War Council first, 1917, and then it became the National Catholic Welfare Council in 1919, then exchanged the word council for conference to become the National Catholic Welfare Conference in 1922. That structure served the American Church until 1966. And following Vatican II, the bishops established two things: the National Conference of Catholic Bishops and its standing secretariat, the United States Catholic Conference. Then in 2001, these were remerged and renamed the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Fortunately, you do not have to remember all that. I just wanted to give you the general overview. Here, I'm going to pretty much just recount because, by the way, we house the papers of the Bishops' Conference of the United States as it goes as far back to the War Council, and it's over 1,000 banker-sized boxes of material. So it is a massive collection of material. But here, I'm going to give you an overview of the early organization of the bishops during wartime, through their formation as a key institution, overseeing the development of a constellation of practices serving American Catholics in many areas of life in the early 20th century. Now, at the heart of the story is how an institution like the Catholic Church, a hierarchical institution, adapted itself to thrive in a pluralistic and democratic society such as is the US. And our story really begins with the First World War. When the United States first entered the war in 1917, it called for, let's move ahead here, it called for volunteer participation by private individuals and organizations to support the war effort. Now, among these supporters was the Catholic Church, which was broadly perceived as an immigrant body whose loyalty and patriotism was suspect, and it was untested in its loyalties, at least from a non-Catholic perspective. Of course, our main allies are France, Britain, Italy, and the United States. The Central Powers were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Many Irish sided with Germany because Germany was against Britain, who ruled the Irish against their will. So this made Irish Catholics suspect, and it made Germans in particular suspect as well. And any of you that know the history of World War I know Germans were widely attacked during that war. By 1910, Germans had been the largest non-English speaking immigrant group in America. And when the war began, individuals, groups, and politicians, made hay of attacking German culture and German influence in the country. So many Germans and Irish were Catholic. And I just want to point out here in this cartoon, related to anti-German sentiment during World War I that this happened at the time, and it brought Catholics were also seen as foreign, as different. So ethnic Catholics really were suspect during the entry into the First World War. So what happens is that the church feels called to address the matter of anti-Catholic sentiment directed at groups like German Catholics and Irish Catholics. And one of the individuals that was responding here under the motto of "For God and Country" was Father John J. Burke, who created the National Catholic War Council in 1917. He was the kind of the brains behind the operation. So Father Burke, pictured here, I don't know if you could see the American flag in the background in the second picture, just to show his patriotism. He was a Paulist. The Paulists was an American religious order created by Isaac Hecker in the 19th century. They were an order of communicators in media, writing, specifically of the American matrix, a uniquely American religious order. And Burke was a member of this particular order. Himself the son of Irish immigrants, he was born in New York City. He ended up taking over the whole Paulist publishing enterprise not long after entering the order. And he saw a fundamental compatibility between the principles the U.S. was founded upon and those of the Catholic Church. He believed that the principles of the Constitution would naturally lead to Catholic truth if they were fully followed. And he also used the concept of the mystical body of Christ, which was that all Christians were of a mystical union with Christ at their head. And I mention this to underscore that this was really the most fitting person to organize and lead this national organization of bishops, which hadn't been organized before. There had been plenary councils, but not a national organization, consultative organization of bishops. So his view of Catholicism was national, specifically American, and the First World War convinced him that the church should act as a unit. He declared the individual, the parish, the society, the diocese must emphasize and sacrifice itself unto that larger Catholic unity of which each is a reflection and from which each borrows its title. That Catholic unity must in turn be employed in the solution of national problems. So he had already helped establish the Catholic Press Association in 1911. 1917, he founds the Chaplains Aid Society to assist military priests during the war. For his efforts, he was eventually awarded the Distinguished Service Medal by the U.S. War Department. And the War Council that he helps found represents the first coming together of the American bishops in a voluntary association to address great national issues affecting the church. Burke would specifically head the council's committee on special war activities, which oversaw all kinds of mobilization of laymen and women in the war. The War Council worked specifically with the Knights of Columbus to provide education and recreation to Catholic men serving in the war, as you know, as Peter referenced. These are a couple of posters from our collection related to the War Council and the Knights of Columbus activities. As you can see, the Knights and the War Council are mentioned in the first poster, which focuses on soldiers. And there were all kinds of camps that were run specifically with women's work to serve meals and provide recreation during the war. So both, groups of lay men and lay women, in addition to clerical individuals, were fully involved in this World War I effort. So the council works with the Knights of Columbus, provides education, recreation to Catholic men serving in the war, and they set up Catholic settlement houses in cities across the country to Americanize immigrants. Again, there's that fear that these Catholic immigrants, these ethnic immigrants, are not American enough. They're not going to be loyal enough. So these settlement houses are set up to help Americanize these immigrants. And every diocese and Catholic organization is pulled into this effort to set up Americanization programs in this war effort. And here, the attempt is to prove Catholics are loyal to America, if not better at being loyal to America than anyone else. So the need for some kind of national organization to begin with is underscored by the fact that several other organizational initiatives, in addition to those Burke had a hand in, had been made a few years earlier, okay? Attempts at nationally organizing. In 1900, several prominent lay Catholics and some bishops attempted to federate a number of Catholic societies that already existed. They created the American Federation of Catholic Societies, as you see, to increase Catholic power in national civic life. They're realizing you need to have some kind of national organizational effort to be able to lobby against all the different groups that might not have your interests at heart, right? 1910, you've got the National Conference of Catholic Charities, founded to create greater efficiency in charitable work and social work. So the need is here. You see the other organizations. And what happens is many in the American hierarchy, ecclesiastics, archbishops, soon realize with Father Burke that this united and coordinated effort in wartime might be reorganized for use in maintaining protection and promoting church interests in peacetime too. So this results in the creation in 1919 of the National Catholic Welfare Council, which involved itself in the federal, state, and local levels of Catholic activity regarding legislation, education, publicity, and social action. In fact, success providing leadership for the growth and development of the Catholic Church in the U.S. induced hierarchies in countries across the world later on to replicate its organizational methods. But it's not without controversy, as you might imagine. First of all, there were pre-existing organizations that were serving Catholic needs in more niche and local ways. Sometimes these organizations, like the Knights of Columbus, felt slighted or competitive with the bishop's own emerging organization. The Catholic Education Association, for example, an Ohio-based lay society founded in 1904, sought to coordinate activities among all Catholic academic institutions. This was the first Catholic professional organization to parallel an existing secular body, the National Education Association, thereby accentuating a Catholic professional distinctiveness, right? And this was a response to anti-Catholic sentiment at the time, but also to different sets of practices and needs in Catholic schools. It also spoke to the rise of professionalization of institutions in the US generally, a happening that coincided with the rise of Protestant organizations. And this is Msgr. William Joseph Kerby, a huge advocate of creating specific Catholic professionalization organizations in order to properly situate oneself as a religion in American society. He was a professor at the Catholic University of America here at Catholic, key figure in articulating a specific Catholic need to establish parallel organizations in a Protestant society. He worried, for example, about leakage of professionals and intellectuals from the church into secular or Protestant society, losing Catholics to secular society, right? He noted that, you know, America is a pluralistic society that offers a host of competing organizations for allegiances, but there is an indifference to religion among those organizations. So establishing specifically Catholic versions was necessary to maintaining faith in the society. He thought group consciousness needed to be nourished outside of worship in order to strengthen faith. And he became a key figure in the rise, for example, of the Catholic charity movement, in fact, helping to transform local Catholic charities into National Conference of Catholic Charities, the forerunner of Catholic Charities USA, and indeed Caritas International, the international organization, right? So the idea was establishing a set of Catholic organizations paralleling Protestant-dominated professional organizations. But while organizations like the Catholic Education Association and Catholic Charities were founded to establish this Catholic presence in American organizational life, this again could lead to competitiveness if the bishops did not articulate their position clearly enough in their desire to oversee these efforts. So what happens is that after the question of forming a new organization to replace the War Council, one headed by the ecclesiastical authorities of the church, the bishops, there are questions over their authority and their role in this organization. First, it should be noted that Pope Benedict XV sends his legate, Archbishop Bonaventura Soretti, to tell the US bishops in 1919, for example, America should be the leader in all things Catholic and to set the example to other nations. And I put this out here for you to read because he did say this, but no one really knew exactly what it meant. What does this mean? You know, there wasn't this coping mechanism in place for dealing with Catholics in a democratic society the way it existed in America. So this caused a lot of sort of discussion and some argument. And here's why. It was a question of ecclesiastical autonomy and authority in a nation where these were being rethought in a democratic context. So Pope Benedict, you know, asks, do this. I don't know how you're going to do it. Do it. So in 1919, the bishops meet as an assembly to discuss the creation of this National Catholic Welfare Council. And this was representative of the whole of the Catholic bishops. Not all bishops were on board, as they thought it might interfere with their diocesan prerogatives, right? Their rule as bishops. But they established it. And at the time, the initial establishment of the National Catholic Welfare Council in 1919, what they did was they started with a committee of 7 bishops, later expanded to 10 as an administrative committee. And they would meet periodically throughout the year, and they would operate a 5-branch secretariat. And the secretariat is listed here. And this was run by John Burke, the brainchild, as its general secretary until his untimely death in 1936. So we have, as the initial institution here, the initial framework that's going to go on after this becomes the National Catholic Welfare Conference, an immigration bureau and motion picture bureau to offer technical assistance to immigrants at ports of entry, very important, of course, many immigrant Catholics, and promote decency in the movie industry, promote morality. A social action department that promotes Catholic views of civic education, industrial relations, and rural welfare through publications and speakers. A Department of Education, you'll see how important that is shortly, that informed the public on Catholic education and dealt with educational matters, which were in great ferment at that time, as there were many attempts to abolish Catholic schools. More on that in a second. A legal department that studied state and federal legislation with a view to either removing anti-Catholic aspects or making the Catholic position known. A press department that provided subscribing newspapers, such as Catholic diocesan newspapers, with a weekly set of articles covering national and international events from the Catholic angle, rather than the predominantly Protestant angle. And a department of lay activities, because the laity was seen as very important in a democratic society. They understood this. That organized Catholic people across the country into the National Conference of Catholic Women and the National Conference of Catholic Men. The NCCW, the women's group, was very successful in running the National Catholic School of Social Work, based here at Catholic University and in DC, which ultimately trained generations of social workers in Catholic social thought. And that school exists to this day and still trains first-rate social workers for work here on campus. Now, the men's group, the NCCM, was a little less successful, except for its Catholic Hour, its media arm. And, you know, they published materials on lay male Catholic life, but I would argue that organizations like the Knights of Columbus and other men's groups were already strong, so maybe that didn't attract as much support. So that's the initial secretariat established under the Welfare Council in 1919. Now, at this point, there is a problem with this emerging organization that illuminates its uniqueness. Now, one of the members of the hierarchy, Cardinal William O'Connell of Boston, does not like this new organization. He initially does, but he and several bishops begin to fear that it's going to impinge on their local authority, which is a real issue here. And they convinced the Vatican in 1921 that the NCWC is a plenary council. Now, what does this mean and why would it be a problem? Well, this means that they convinced the Vatican that the National Catholic Welfare Council would introduce parliamentary government into the church and that the council would then legislate for American Catholics, thereby undermining the power of the individual bishops in their dioceses. So several other bishops favoring the organization then argued for its restoration after the skepticism came up. And Pope Pius XI, now the Pope at the time, 1922, makes them clarify that their organization is voluntary for the bishops, and the name is changed to conference instead of council, so it doesn't have this kind of legislative authority, right? So now we have a consultative organization. And in 1922, 80% of the bishops, the American bishops, signed a statement to Rome supporting the organization. So there was wide American support for it. So by 1922, we now have what's known as the National Catholic Welfare Conference. It does have this other name change that I told you about in the beginning, which is beyond our scope, but the institution is now established. And John Burke, who is serving as secretary, says, he describes it this way: techniques of lobbying, constituency building, influence peddling, manipulation of public opinion. He points out that special interests had learned to solicit endorsements from well-known individuals who knew little of the real significance of proposed legislation. We need people to go and influence policy on Capitol Hill so it doesn't undermine Catholicism in the United States. He says this. He also says, when the matter is actually presented in the halls of Congress, they who are back of it have the big advantage of position, initiative, planned campaign. So he argues that having a national Catholic organization in Washington enables Catholics to preserve our own religious rights, contribute to our preeminent share to the legislation that will shape and control the destiny of our country. So he points this out. We need this to be a group that lobbies for Catholic interests. He sees it, though, as pursuing policy rather than political activity. He also points out that groups like the YMCA, the Protestant Federal Council of Churches, all did the same with their own resources. So he's very savvy this way. As Archbishop, the first head of the Secretariat, Archbishop Edward Hanna put it in 1922, the Welfare Council grew out of a great fear and a great hope, the fear that hostile forces or organizations would make a successful attack on Catholic interests, particularly our schools, the hope that the bishops, by fraternal union, would be able not only to protect Catholic interests, but to advance them for the sake of religion and our country. So from the 1922 through the 1960s, this organization addressed a range of matters in this particular structure, okay? And I thought now I would just mention a few examples of the things they did so you could see the concrete effects of this institution. Okay, so first of all, in the area of Catholic social justice, it performed an important educative function. Just after the war, the bishops issued something called the Bishops' Program for Social Reconstruction. This is a copy signed by Father John A. Ryan, who wrote it, and it was a plan of social reform. John Ryan was a professor of sacred theology at Catholic University, and he combines progressive thought and Catholic theology, specifically the teachings in Rerum Novarum, the encyclical from 1891. And he argues that for the government agencies to find jobs and housing for returning veterans, vocational training programs, minimum wage legislation, comprehensive state insurance programs for the sick, unemployed, and elderly, the elimination of child labor. And this was labeled socialistic at the time, but much of the program would be implemented by the New Deal years. And Msgr Ryan himself, he's in the center there, he became an important consultant to the New Deal administration. Served on, he knew the justices, as you can see, he knew Roosevelt himself. He gave the benediction at the Roosevelt inaugurations. And he actually became the head of the Social Action Department, that particular administrative arm. And what they did was they employed staff to go around the country and educate Americans on how Catholic social teaching spoke to industrial matters, living wage issues, and economic and social issues. They became a kind of information clearinghouse on matters of Catholic social justice as applied to American life. And I would point out a chief staff member at this time was a woman named Lina Bressette. She traveled the country teaching on the encyclicals and other matters. And I stuck in there a little clip from a 1953 cartoon in the treasure chest of Fun in Fact, a Catholic comic book that did a whole set of panels on Lina Bressette, seemingly forgotten. They pointed out all of the influence she had on minimum wage legislation, Catholic teachings, etc. So she was part of that effort. So that's Catholic social teaching. The next area was in Catholic education. You may or may not know that the 1920s saw a national upswing in anti-Catholic activity. The KKK, for example, had millions of members. I believe 4 million members or more in the country at the time. And in addition to being anti-Black, they were actually focused in their hatred on Catholics and Jews. As a result, there were attempts to abolish Catholic parochial schools in several states, and these attempts were spearheaded by groups like the KKK and certain groups of Masons, Scottish Rite Masons in Oregon, for example. Now, one attempt was made in Oregon in 1922, and these are some of their anti-Catholic cartoons I have here. The local bishop in Oregon, Alexander Christie, was unable to marshal resources to fight what they called a compulsory school law that actually would abolish Catholic schools in the state of Oregon and force children to go to only public schools. But the NCWC's John Burke and the head of its education department, James Hugh Ryan, raised funds, hired lawyers, and mediated between Oregon Catholics and the National Catholic Welfare Conference to bring the case to the Supreme Court, which overturned the law and sent the signal to the other states trying to do the same. And it was a huge win for Catholic education in the United States that probably wouldn't have been possible without the efforts of the NCWC. So Catholic education. In the area of immigration and Americanization. Now, as you would imagine, the church was very interested in the immigrant population. By 1910, you've got over 16 million Catholics in the US out of a total population of 92 million. By 1920, this number had grown to 20 million people. So you've got millions of Catholic immigrants in the US, and the immigrants created communities that differed considerably from the established Anglo-Protestant pattern. And many of these ethnic Catholics were shunned by the Protestant majority, were discriminated against. So what the NCWC Social Action Department did was they sponsored Americanization classes and published books like these. This is a Romanian edition of a Civics Catechism where these would be passed out at these Americanization classes in ethnic communities. And as you could see, Chapter 1, American Democracy, and then it's translated into Romanian for Romanians. And, you know, these books essentially taught how to be a citizen in the United States. And they were in multiple languages, Polish, Italian, Arabic. And that was another way that immigrants were dealt with by the Catholic Church. The Church mediated their Americanization. They also established an immigration department that directly addressed the needs of immigrants in ports of entry. So, immigration. Media and popular culture. So the NCWC also established a press department specifically devoted to Catholic information, established in 1920, and you see the earlier version here on the left. The National Catholic Welfare Council Press Department provided the Catholic press, radio, and eventually television in the United States and other countries with news, editorial features, and picture services gathered and prepared by professional journalists and released under the names NCWC News Service. Now, as you probably know, most dioceses have their own newspapers focused on Catholic affairs, but the press department covered issues of national significance and international significance, which the local papers ran as subscribers. Now, what this meant was that Catholics could tell their own story and not go, for example, to, you know, the cartoon you saw in the first panel where, you know, the anti-German sentiment was being expressed. So they didn't have to only absorb the Protestant-dominated narrative at the time. So they helped generate a national Catholic and American identity. So again, the national idea is crucial here. There's no national and Catholic institution in existence, one that concerns so many different facets of American life prior to the establishment of the NCWC. And its creation was a product of the church's adaptation to democratic life, with political institutions that required participation and advocacy of one's view in a pluralistic society to survive. Yeah, so this final image, this is the last panel. You can see all the different types of news that was being reported through this Catholic arm of the NCWC, and then all the subscribers to the NCWC news service. So they provided that particular service as well. And then on the side, you could just see the subscribers, the list, so you get a sense that there were many. So happy to take questions at this point or comments.
Thank you, Maria. Very grateful for the information. And of course, many of these agencies are still familiar with us today that you point out. But I think the fascinating part is the evolution of this. There was no formal entity known as the Bishops' Conference until World War I, and then only out of necessity was that only out of necessity did it become a what would I describe it as, a formal entity, and then the evolution from the War Council to the Welfare Council to the Welfare Conference and what have you. You know, we all know that the development of the United States, the Catholic Church has contributed in so many ways, most notably, I guess you would say, in healthcare and education and in social services. But all of them were, it seems, at least guided, if not in some way influenced, at least, by this Bishops' conference. And then it still continues today in so many other capacities in public policy and what have you. But the genesis of it was World War I, and the fascinating element, at least for those of us who are in the Knights of Columbus, of course, is that it was you know, the Knights' involvement in trying to provide the services for the doughboys in World War I that led to it. I was making some notes as we went along of some of the questions. If there are still other questions, I'll try to keep on top of those as well. But you mentioned, let's see, the question that I noted, if I could read my shorthand, you talked about Germans as the largest immigrant group, non-English speaking. Can you by any chance compare them in size of population with the Irish, Maria? Do we have a sense of how they compared?
So, well, exact numbers, I'd have to look that up specifically, but what you have are essentially the two largest groups of Catholics and immigrants coming in the 19th century are Germans and Irish. And they came before you have the wide influx of Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans. So, so you have a massive, millions of them have come by the 1890s, which is when the Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans have come. So you really have massive populations of, and Irish spoke English, so they stood out less. They could blend more. But Germans tended to be very persistent about their social organizations, their Vereins, for example, the Catholic Vereins, and they tended to stay in their communities and speak their languages a little bit more. So they were the two largest Catholic immigrant groups at that time, and there were millions of them. And you know, one of the big stories of World War I that most people don't know is that German culture as it existed. I mean, you know, it went from sauerkraut to liberty cabbage. They were talking about sauerkraut to liberty cabbage, for example. They renamed towns so they didn't have words like Berlin in them. Germans were beat up. They removed German languages. They even banned Mozart, in concerts, that sort of thing. So it kind of washed out a lot of German culture from the mainstream culture at that particular time. And there were a lot of Germans, and so it's kind of tragic that it happened.
Another question that came up, you mentioned several times the term plenary as gatherings of the bishops. What is specifically meant by the term plenary?
Plenaries are specifically canon law authorized organizations of bishops that would meet to decide on the legislation of the church. The U.S. Catholic bishops did have plenaries. They had them throughout the 19th century, and they would make various decisions as to how the church would conduct itself in the United States. At the 1884 plenary, just to give you an example, that was when they decided to establish Catholic University as a national and Catholic university. And shortly after, Pope Leo approved it and it was established. The difference with the Welfare Conference is it's specifically attempting to engage with the institutions of the United States, which is really different, right? So conference is to get together to National Catholic Welfare Conference is conferencing over engagement with the broader society according to those different parts of the organization, the administrative parts of the organization that I laid out. Plenaries are specifically established as ecclesiastical units where bishops would decide what would happen within the Catholic Church in the United States, and they're authorized by canon law. So that's why they didn't want this to be a council, because it sounded too much like it was authorized by the ecclesiastical rules of the church. But they needed something like this because they were operating within a democratic society at the same time. That's why it's so interesting.
Mentioned that in the early 1920s, the Holy Father, I think it was Pius XI, sent a legate, or it might have been Benedict the 15th, sent a legate to the United States to lend support or approbation, papal approbation for this new establishment. And I think the quote that you used was to set the example for other nations. And so talk about the development of that, because now conferences of Catholic bishops are very common, both on a national and a multinational basis.
It's so fascinating. One thing I couldn't get into was the history of Americanism within the Catholic Church, which most people don't know about, even people who know a little bit about Catholicism. What happens in the late 19th century is there is a huge controversy over how the Catholics should regard the American democratic project. Some of them think that the church should remain insulated and in its own institutions. Others, and that's, for example, William O'Connell, Michael Corrigan of New York. On the other hand, James Gibbons of Baltimore, Dennis O'Connell, who was a rector here at the school, the Archbishop Ireland in Minnesota, they favor adaptation to American democratic institutions. All of that is simmering beneath the surface of this statement that Benedict the 15th makes. And just to remind you, Benedict the 15th was very torn up over what was happening in Europe and what was happening to Italy during the war. And he made many statements against the war. So he was interested in, what's happening in America. Maybe the Americans can deal with this whole situation and things will work out better there. So he sent his legate, Archbishop Bonaventure Ceretti, and to tell the U.S. bishops for America to be the leader in all things Catholic and to set the example to other nations. That's what he said. And I'll give you these slides afterwards so people can look at the slides. I put this on the slide. And then, that became, what does this mean? Now, like, for example, William O'Connell, he thought, we don't want to accommodate too much to America because then the bishop loses their authority in the diocese. And we don't want to just completely become, quote, washed out as a religion in the American context. So that's all under the surface of this, is we want to function properly in this society, but we don't want to completely accommodate the society. The genius of someone like John Burke is he understood that Catholics had to have an activist arm among other groups in a pluralist society. That was kind of his genius. Like, if we don't do this, the whole society is going to roll over us. None of the legislation is going to support us. I gave you the example of the Catholic schools. Without the NCWC, the parochial schools might have been abolished in several states in the 1920s. They were trying to do it. So that's the balance. That's the interesting balance going on at that particular time. I hope that answers the question.
I have another question regarding the relationship or comparing and contrasting the NCWC and the National Council of Catholic Charities. Did they have a formal relationship? How were they structurally different?
Ooh, that's a good question. So National Conference of Catholic Charities, which I think you said council, but I think you mean conference. National Conference of Catholic Charities was established actually here on campus in 1910. And it was under Msgr Kerby and John O'Grady, Msgr John O'Grady. And what happened there was a whole, as you can imagine, there were so many impoverished Catholics that needed charity on the Eastern Seaboard especially, but elsewhere, Chicago too, and on the West Coast, that there are so many local charitable organizations that Kerby and O'Grady realized, like, we need to develop what we call today best practices. We need to start training people in groups to minister to all of these individuals. And Catholics have a very strong tradition of charity. And they would take, for example, the local St. Vincent de Paul societies. There were a lot of those. There were a lot of local Catholic charitable organizations. And they set up this social work school here in Washington, D.C. to train people to work in those societies. And the National Conference of Catholic Charities arose with the rise of the professionalization of social and charitable work in 1910. And they were integrated with each other. O'Grady was heavily involved in, NCWC affairs. And John Ryan was interested in charitable activities and wrote for the National Catholic Charities Review. A lot of these people were all on campus together. They would have conferences on campus and lectures on best practices in Catholic charities would be given, for example. So it was very much integrated, and they sort of fed off each other, So yes, they were integrated. Catholic Charities came first, eventually leading into the Catholic Charities USA and Caritas International.
Next question, Maria. What is significant about the Immigrant Bureau and the Motion Picture Bureau linked together in the NCWC?
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Well, they would eventually be separated, and there'd be a Legion of Decency that would be separated from the Immigration Department. And, I'm not sure exactly why they were put together. Maybe the idea was that immigrants coming to this country should be protected from some of the indecency of the emerging motion picture industry. But they would be separated eventually. And the Legion of Decency would operate separately and review movies, and those reviews would be published in Catholic newspapers, and they would operate separately. I would say that immigration and the emerging motion picture industry were integrated, tied to each other in the beginning, and then gradually they were teased apart and they became separate institutions. And then a Department of Immigration was eventually established. That was its own entity also.
And then this is a question from the same individual. I think it's calling more for an insight, but I find it very very noteworthy. The Bishops' Conference, the USCCB, as it's currently called, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, has recently announced that they will be terminating the Catholic News Service. And your final slide in your PowerPoint presentation showed all of the press offices outreach, if you will. And later this year, Catholic News Service, which is the name that that agency has been operating under for recent decades is going to come to an end. And do you have any insight about that? And what can you share, given the fact that this is an outreach of the Catholic bishops or the NCWC from its very beginnings?
Yeah, I'm assuming you're not asking me for a fact base, and I'm an employee of Catholic University, not the Bishops' Conference. I'm interpreting the papers. But I mean, to me, the idea that the Bishops' Conference helps create a narrative, a national narrative around topics of interest to Catholics was very important in these 100 years. And the press department and Catholic News Service doing that was very important. And it makes me sad, actually, that that there won't be a news service that's provides that. I knew those reporters. I've talked to those reporters on various subjects. They were good journalists. And I guess it's the end of an era, over 100 years. And they won't be doing that anymore, but I don't know, maybe something else will come in to fill the vacuum.
Thank you. So it certainly was a need that the bishops identified at the outset of this organization, and perhaps they feel that need can be fulfilled differently, or the need has changed over time. But that's the end of the questions that we have, Maria. I'm extremely grateful for a very informative presentation. I think it's important to note that this is not just Catholic Church history in the United States. This is very much American history. It's not in our mainstream education, our mainstream understanding of history in the evolution of the United States, but nonetheless, it's a very important component. I want, before we sign off, to remind viewers of Dr. Msgr's handout. The live viewers who are participating, there is a utility at the right side of your screen, and there is an opportunity for you to download a PDF document for further reading. It'll provide you more information and more resources that you can refer to if you'd like to dig deeper into this subject. I'll say that next month we'll be back with another presentation about the intertwined histories of baseball and the Knights of Columbus. So I invite our viewers to stay tuned for that. Thank you again for your participation in this session, your interest. Please share the link so that others can enjoy it as well. And until the next time, God bless and so long.